Great.
This is Kevin Pruitt with another episode of Rising Tide Startups podcast, and my guest today is Letitia Seglah. Letitia, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Kevin. Thank you very much. Hello to the audience as well. I'm very excited to join.
Well, please share with our listening audience, who is Letitia Seglah?
Okay, so I am an independent consultant and I provide various services to organizations, mainly within the banking sector.
Uh-huh.
So predominantly business management, which includes risk, regulation, compliance, and within that space, I then work with their technology teams in terms of how they can implement technology to address those issues. And I also work as an independent expert with the European Commission and work with them in the same vein in terms of, policies around innovation, risk compliance within the financial sector.
So in other words, let me translate. So you're a classic underachiever, and and you have a lot of spare time on your hands. Wow, what a bio. We're going to have to list that in the show notes. Our listening audience would love to see that on paper to see exactly what all that entails. But so do you work mainly with the European Commission more, or are you working more within the banking industry within the UK?
So I work predominantly in the UK, and in my role, so I'd say that takes up probably about 80% of my time. And then 20% of that time, I work with the European Commission, looking at things like, their policy instruments for, the sector, giving monitoring and evaluation in terms of what the policies have been drafted, what they mean, the implications. So basically working with them as an industry practitioner, giving them feedback in terms of their policies, what it actually means for the industry, any pain points it may cause, etc.
So the internet blipped just a tiny bit on the very, very first part of your answer. You said so 80% is mainly in the UK?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I was trying to put that math together. So now nobody wakes up as a consultant. So kind of what was the pathway leading you? Like what did you study at uni? How did you get when you came out? What was the pathway that you walked, going from university to where you are today?
Yeah. I mean, it was a long, drawn path, to be honest with you. And I mean, for the essence of time, I'd say going back to university, I actually wanted to be a neuroscientist, and I needed to work in order to finance my education and my living costs. So, looked for jobs, happened to get a job in banking. And then when I finished my degree, I actually had more experience in banking than I did in the medical side of things. So then it made sense to, kind of continue that career trajectory. But somehow I knew inside myself that, I'm a humanitarian. I like social humanities, social studies, etc. But I'm also quite business savvy as well. So it made sense to move into that. And, within banking, I worked very much in roles where it was thinking about consumer finance, behavioral economics. So in a way, I was able to use my background in psychology and sociology in that space. But I always had this burning desire that I wanted to start a business. And unfortunately, I'm not one of these people who, have an amazing idea like Facebook or Twitter and, just invent something. So I had a journey where I was gaining experience through my profession. And then some part around the middle of my career background, there was quite a lot of restructuring for the organization I was working for at the time. And I had an opportunity to work on a project where they were building out new branches of the bank across locations in the Middle East and Africa.
Okay.
And working in that role made me realize that I really had a burning desire to do something for myself, being in the field, starting things from scratch. So after the project, I took the opportunity to move on and started contracting, and from contracting that led to my consultancy. And I found that there was a gap in the market where a lot of transformation change, business change projects were working either with life consultants,
Okay.
like your usual, PwCs, KPMGs.
Right.
They were career consultants, but not necessarily practitioners.
Yeah.
And I was a practitioner. I'd work within a specialized role, a technical role, and there was a lot of regulatory change taking place at that time. So there was an opportunity to come on board and consult these organizations and be able to provide that technical experience as well.
Sure.
So it was a
Based
mixture
on
of
your background, for
timing.
sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So it was a mixture of timing, the background, and also, what happened to me, a restructure. And with that, came, I know people don't like this word, but a redundancy.
Right. Right.
But
Yeah.
often
In the States, we call it layoff.
a layoff, yes,
That's
a layoff.
yes.
And it was voluntary because, I could have taken it, but I could have stayed on
Hmm.
and tried to find something else. But I felt like something just felt right about taking the redundancy. And I didn't know what it was, and I didn't have any plans, but I took it and it felt right. And in the 6 months it took me to self reflect and think about what I wanted to do, I then came up with the idea for my consultancy, and with a mixture of what was happening in the market, and my availability as
Hmm.
well.
I mean,
Things just
often
happened.
like the redundancy packages, though, carry you, 3 to 6 months. So you kind of have that window of time, thankfully, to make some of those pivot decisions that you had to make. So I
Yeah.
want to go back just a second to something you said a minute ago about the PwC or KPMG, the career consultant. I think in some ways that's almost an oxymoron where you,
Yeah,
if you have a career consultant, because it seems like they will only ever have half the picture.
yeah.
They will only understand the basic tenets of consultancy, but they may not understand the tenets of being a practitioner. And
Mm,
that's why,
mm,
you can look back and so many of our episodes during the interview, we come to this conclusion that, nothing in your past is wasted in your future.
mm.
Everything is kind of building into this beautiful mosaic, this picture of what your future looks like. And it sounds like to me that working through the bank, you may not want to mention this, but I'm guessing, was this like HSBC was the bank you were working for, or
And when I left, it was actually JP Morgan.
okay? Because
Yeah.
when we lived in the Middle East for just a short time, and actually we had HSBC there, and I knew that they had a strong presence in that part of the world. But it's
Mm.
interesting that the banking sector in the UK is extremely complex. So you you have a work ahead of you for sure. Let me also ask you. So while you were working for the banking company, were
Mhm.
there consultants that bank hired that you kind of saw how they did their role, how they worked on contract? Did that kind of help you determine how you would do this as a consultant?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my comment about career consultants, I hope that's not taken in, any kind of derogatory
No,
light.
I used it that way.
Um, no, 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 because, I think sometimes when we talk about other professionals, sometimes people think you're being, critical. And by no
Absolutely.
means am I being critical about that. Um, my point was that, that technical industry experience isn't always there, but that creates an opportunity for people like me
Right.
to step in.
Exactly.
But what I lacked was this ability to sell myself, and consultants are brilliant at that. They talk to people all the time,
Right.
they're selling themselves all the time, they're speaking to stakeholders, presenting results. So they're very good at self promotion. And that's something that I didn't have because I was a subject matter expert. I
Sure.
was siloed. I was good at,
Yeah.
my data, so on and so forth. So looking at these consultants and seeing the way that they engaged with the stakeholders, looking at the way that they presented information
Right.
and they presented themselves made me think actually that's probably what I need to work on the most. And then saying that as well, there's that side of things, but also consultants, they know best practice because it's their job, it's their
Exactly.
industry to know best practice.
Exactly.
So from that, I
But
felt
across the
like
board. Not
Exactly.
necessarily industry specific, but across the board they would know. Yeah, that. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
So I felt like those are really important skills, self-promotion, and then also knowing best practice. So I had a lot of work to do.
mm.
And of course, it's still a work in progress.
Aren't
And
we
I
all?
don't, yeah. And I don't want to, kind of idealize my journey, because I think often people see where someone is now, but they don't necessarily know all the intricate details of that journey. And there were fears in that journey. There are still fears
Sure.
now.
Yeah.
Being made redundant, thinking, okay, yes, I have 6 months severance package, but what next?
Mm.
And when you don't have an income for a period of time, you realize, oh my gosh, this is dwindling. Actually, what I
Yep.
do have, there's
I mean,
nothing
6 months
coming.
sounds like a long time until
It's
you're actually in the middle of it. Yeah.
exactly. So there was a lot of work to do in terms of how do I survive? Do I sink or swim?
Right.
And for me, that was the greatest thing about overcoming that period is just thinking about how do I formalize my fears. Mostly for most people, when you want to leave a profession to start your own business, or
Sure.
you want to start a business, from whatever stage you are in life, the biggest thing is fear.
We're going to
And
drill down on that in just a minute.
yes,
So we're
great.
going to drill down. We're going to drill down even deeper in that transformation. But so what I wanted to do is circle back. When did you start? When did you transition into consultancy?
So that was 2012.
Okay. So you've been
So I had
independent for 6 years virtually.
correct,
Okay.
correct. And I mean, it's tough. That transition is tough because I'd always, I guess, for a period of time, I'd had permanent jobs,
Mm-hmm.
and I'd got used to, that kind of infrastructure. And then I suddenly had to learn again that being a consultant, you're constantly pitching for things, for example, why self-promotion was important for me, learning from the consultants that I'd worked with previously, that were brought in by my employer. It made me realize that you constantly have to sell yourself. Every
Right.
single
Right.
opportunity you have to self-promote, and it can be done subtly.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be the hard sell, but because you need to create that new job for yourself or that new source of income for yourself, you constantly have to be in business development mode.
Exactly. And I think, you mentioned that one thing that you're learning from the PwCs and KPMGs is how can you sell yourself? And I think, there's really two prongs. I mean, you've got the promotional marketing side of things, but you've also got the I guess the product of your service. So what have you done in the past that you can show in your portfolio that is a benefit to someone, moving forward? So it's words you say, but it's also work you've produced,
Absolutely.
historically. So since you started your consultancy, tell me, what would you say would be the lowest point that you struggled with?
The lowest point, I mean, there's been a few. Which one do I pick? Um, the lowest point I would say is just trying to find out, what my niche is, what is my USP.
Right.
And sometimes there's a lot of noise within a space. So, for example, if you look at things like LinkedIn and you look at people who have got similar job titles
Mm-hmm.
like you can start to compare and think, oh, they have this, they do this, this, that, and the other. But you have to almost shut out that noise and just focus on actually, what am I good at? What do I really enjoy? And what could I improve? And then create a portfolio of work around that. So, things that you really love and enjoy. Maybe it might be writing articles and applying that to how you can write articles which sell your
Sure.
business or
Right.
sell your services,
Right.
etc. So it's figuring out. I'd say that's part of the lowest point is figuring out, how you can market yourself. What are your skills? What competition is out there? But not feeling intimidated by that
Mm-hmm.
competition, rather feeling like you also have your space, within the field, and people like choice. companies like choice, clients like choice. So
Right.
even if there are competitors,
Right.
you are still a good enough choice for them. You offer something which is great.
Well, you've shown that. I mean, if you've survived for 6 years, you've shown that somehow you have walked through the valley of your lowest point, and so now that leads us to segue into our next. What do you think has been your highest high since you started your consultancy?
My highest, I would say, is getting this role with the European Commission, which was completely, out of nowhere. And I think I had done something pro bono at some point. And those people who, I worked with, one of them recommended me because, they were working with the commission.
Right.
So for me, that was a high point, because it just goes to show that you don't know where your opportunity will come from. And sometimes, when you are independent, getting an income is really important, right? Having that nest egg is important. And sometimes you can maybe dismiss the pro bono things, right? But you have to be strategic about what you
Yeah.
do pro bono
Yeah.
because they might bring you bigger and better opportunities. So
Oh,
that was
it is a step leading to something else. Did they approach you or did you approach them for this role?
so they approached me. They approached
See,
me
that's
because
even
of
better.
yeah. I mean, that's certainly a good form of validation, I guess.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love that. I love that. So when in the 6 years that you've been doing this, I mean, there are things that I think rise to the top. So what would you say would be your two biggest pain points or obstacles that you face on an ongoing basis in your business that our listeners may be able to speak into? I mean, we have a wide variety of listening audience, wide amount of experience. We have consultants. We have, I started my company yesterday, and everything in between. So what would you say would be one or two really extreme obstacles or pain points that you face?
Mm. I would say first and foremost, it's yourself, your own fears, as I highlighted before.
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes it can feel more rational than other times. But I think you have to take a step back and think, actually, if this worst case scenario that I imagine was to happen, how would I cope? How would I survive? And actually, we have all the tools to be able to survive. The human spirit has that, whether
Mm-hmm.
it's I don't know, losing a client and having to find another client, you will find a way to survive. We have that survival instinct. So
So
I'd
drill
say,
down a little bit. So fear of fill in the blank specifically. I'm afraid. I would be afraid of.
yeah, I'd be afraid of losing a client and therefore losing my income.
Or
I'd
the
be
business
afraid.
failure as a whole? Or are you talking about
Yes,
more specifics?
exactly. That could
Okay,
be that could be it as well. I think initially in the beginning, I felt like the business failure as a whole was the biggest obstacle, the
sure.
biggest pain point.
Yeah,
But
that
then
may have
when I
abated over
started,
time. Yeah,
exactly.
when the
But
EU
I,
comes calling, that probably helps abate that fear. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
no worries. But then you get these, kind of subsets of fears as well.
Sure.
So I think fear is the biggest thing. I think also, and again, it relates to fear. It's networking. I think some
Hmm.
people are afraid of networking or they don't know how. Um, and I've learned over time that it's something very natural. It's always a case of speaking to someone as if they're your best friend, for example. And for me, I'm kind of I'm in the middle. I'm an introvert, extrovert. So for me, I'm not fully extroverted where I can just bound into a room and
Hmm.
just be like, oh, hey, here I am, talk to me. I'm a little bit shy. So it's figuring out again, around my personality, what tools work with me, right? What do I feel comfortable with when I walk into a room full of people? Um, how do I network with them? And then the other pain point I'd say is team building as well. It's really difficult to actually build a team around you. And many of those difficulties may come from things like living in London, where it's such a transient place.
Sure.
People move around all the time.
Yeah.
So you might find the perfect person, but it may not be for a while. Sorry, it may not be for, as long as you would have
Right.
liked. And then, of course, actually managing people, working with people, motivating people. So things like that are pain points. And I think when you come from a large organization, you know that you learn how to work with people, you learn how to negotiate with people, and agree on things. But when you suddenly have to work on your own and you have to build a team from scratch, it's actually difficult to take yourself outside of your own little bubble and think
Sure.
about, who do I need? What do I need them for? What kind of skills? So building a team
Right.
around you and your business can be a pain point as well.
Uh, Absolutely, and that one comes up fairly frequently in our interviews, about teaming and about even delegating work. And it all stems, I think, from the same kind of root cause. So, with your specific consultancy, are you like a solo consultant, or do you have a team that's actually hired within the consultancy, or do you outsource and partner with and share services, or how does the structure work with your company?
So I'm a solo consultant, but I work with various partners,
Hmm.
so that I can have the flexibility, as part of a consortium.
Sure.
But I work predominantly on my own, in order to pitch for certain projects. But
Hmm.
then I work with my partners in order to also co-pitch for projects as well.
Hmm.
But I have such a secretarial, accounting, etc.
Right. So when you work for a client, are you on site primarily with them? They have, okay, here's your designated cubicle office space, or is your office like the Tube in Starbucks? I mean, how how does how does this normally work? I mean, do you have a dedicated space? Or is it primarily you just go from contract to contract and work in their locations?
Yeah, so actually, it's a mixture of all of those. It depends on the contract that I have at the
Uh
time.
huh.
So, for example, the current contract that I have with the corporate bank, I work on site with them, and I go to their, offices, etc., and I have a dedicated desk. But I may also get other roles where it's more remote,
Right.
where I don't need to be, I can be location
Sure.
independent, and therefore will be, working in the Starbucks,
Now.
or the
Yeah.
local coffee shops.
Exactly.
And it's funny actually, because yesterday on the BBC, our TV channel, major
Hmm.
TV channel here, they were talking about how long is it, how appropriate is it to stay in a coffee shop and work, as a freelancer, because
That's right.
proprietors are complaining, that
Exactly.
freelancers come and they buy the one coffee
That's
and then
right. You've been here for 6 hours and you bought the smallest coffee on the menu. Yeah. About 2 days a week, Starbucks is my office. So, yeah, they probably would prefer that I buy more than I actually do. So, well, as we're heading kind of toward the latter part of our interview today, we want to drill down a little bit and just get to know you a little better, and just kind of get inside your head just a little bit on an area that we actually call kind of a life quad area. So it's four questions that are a little more drilled down specific about you. So who do you follow online that really inspires you, and why?
Yes, so I follow a professor called Ndubuisi Ikekwe.
Uh huh. You're gonna have
He's
to
a
spell that in
Nigerian.
my show note. You're gonna have to send me a note on that one. So,
Yes, I will certainly send you the link to that. And he's an entrepreneur and scholar. He's quite prominent within the States and Nigeria.
uh huh.
And he was an electrical engineer, and then he became a banker, and then a professor. And
Like you, another classic underachiever.
but I really like him. I really like the content that he posts because it's always so informative. It's always so well thought out, so well
Mm,
researched, but it's also easy to digest as well. So, when we think professor, we think high academics,
yeah.
high research, but because he's got this background of working in business and is now a professor, he knows how to mix, the more intellectual side of the topic with
Hmm.
the practical
Yeah.
side. And I absolutely love his posts because it's always on point. And I can give you an example of the kind of things that he posts. So let's have a look. Da, 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 da.
And we can add that in the show notes as well if you send me that link.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I'll make sure that I do. Um, Sorry, my internet is quite slow at the moment. Yeah, but he'll talk about things like so fees in banking,
Uh-huh.
why it's driving traditional banking to lose their customers, and why fintech is working
Sure.
for, for customers.
Yeah.
But it's well thought out, and he really shows good examples. And I mean, why for me he's really someone important that I follow is because I think he's a thought leader. He knows his subject. It's well researched. It's appropriate to the channel as
Mm-hmm.
well.
Mm-hmm.
But it's always interesting because I feel like I learn a lot from what he says. So it's exciting. I actually wait for his post.
So, is there a special life quote that you try to fasten your life after?
Like I would say, I mean, there's quite a lot of quotes out there, but I have something for myself, which is that the greatest power that you can have in any situation is the power to walk away.
Hmm.
Um,
I like that.
because thank you. Because I think for me, it makes me realize that I am empowered in every single situation, that life brings to you. And you have that power to just take a step back and just look at it and just analyze and reflect and just think, can I continue in this way or shall I continue in that way or just discontinue, altogether? So for me, that keeps me going a lot.
That quote is so powerful for especially a solo entrepreneur, one that's even getting started. I mean, you mentioned earlier in our interview about one thing that you struggled with early was trying to figure out your niche.
Mm,
And I mean, that's almost counterintuitive to somebody trying to get started. And you probably struggled with that. You think, okay, I've got to have business. So I have to have business from a broad,
mm,
variety of clientele here. So because I just need business right now. But really, it's the counterintuitive part is that when you niche down, that you really more separate yourself from the competition, and you clearly identify who you are and what the service you're trying to provide. So
mm.
that is such sage advice. So speaking of advice, so if you could go back 6 years, and I know you've learned a lot in the last 6 years, but if you could give yourself one succinct piece of advice, what would you tell yourself 6 years ago?
I would say that the what you fear is not as great as the fear itself. And you have the tools to digest that fear into smaller parts and tackle those smaller parts.
Eat the proverbial elephant one bite at a time.
Yes, that's right.
I love it. I love that. Well, I have thoroughly enjoyed our time today, and I mean, one of the pain points you mentioned was like networking and putting yourself out there. But I mean, you're extremely articulate, and I think you have a very strong presence. So I mean, that to me is almost counterintuitive. I mean, I think you've done extremely well today, and I'm really grateful for you taking the time and sharing with our audience. And I think that they're going to be well impressed, as the Brits would say, with your with your experience with the European Commission. And is there anything that you wanted to add that I have not touched on that you think would be just a help to our listening audience? And then I'm going to wrap up by asking how we can find you.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So just going back to that fear again, and the reason I keep mentioning it is just because it is a real thing that, is a part of life.
Yeah.
Um, but the way I have worked or I've learned to work with those fears is, as I say, to dissect them and then think practically about how do you actually resolve them at each point. And then you start to realize that actually the sum of all of my fears is it's not that great.
Mm.
And I either have the tools or the network or the people around me to be able to help me cope, when, as and when I think this will happen. So you are more capable of overcoming those fears than you think you are.
Mm.
And actually, in the grand scheme of things, they're not that big, you know. They're really not that big.
Listening audience, have you heard this? Have you heard what she's trying to drill down and actually convey to us? And what a timely message for, because fear is so prevalent in
Mm,
just life itself. But
mm,
primarily, for where we're more concerned about that is how it affects people that are entrepreneurial in nature, and
correct.
it can be debilitating. It can have analysis paralysis, and
Yes.
all the things of just being afraid to take that step, and even afraid to even start.
Yes.
So I mean,
Yes.
overcoming fear it's so timely, like I said, for today. So
Mm.
how can we find you? How can we find you online, and what's the best way to get in touch with you?
Yep, so I'm on LinkedIn.
Yep.
I have my own website, which is letitiaseglah.com. And I also have a Twitter account, which is FinTech RegTech at FinTech RegTech. So those are the best ways to find me.
All right. One last question I got to ask you, since you're in that industry. What's your take on the blockchain technology? What's your take on Bitcoin and all its little brothers?
I would
And we'll keep it
say
brief.
yes, yes, absolutely. So I would say in terms of cryptocurrencies, there's a lot that's going to happen. But just be prudent in terms of what you're investing in. In terms of blockchain itself, the technology itself, I think there's a vast amount of opportunity out there for how it will change industry.
Yep.
So I think if we start focusing more on the technology itself, we will realize actually what a benefit and how much it can change the way that we currently do things. So I think that's something exciting to wait for.
What a way to end this interview, Letitia. Thank you so much for your time today, and listening audience, it's your turn. It's your turn to listen to this podcast and speak into the pain points that she's identified. And as we like to say to end every podcast, we want to speak in and add feedback so all boats rise in a rising tide. Letitia, thanks again.
Thank you very much, Kevin.